This is the second part of a two-part story, so if you haven't listened to the previous episode, I'd suggest you do that first and come back here afterwards. Okay, on with the show. Welcome to the TheMediaWard podcast. We left the story with the Hughes Glomar Explorer leaving its west coast staging grounds in search of the wreckage of a Soviet ballistic missile submarine. Its goal was to recover the sub from below 3 miles of ocean and return it to the surface to learn about the nuclear weapons she carried, and the navy that she belonged to. After having left the Californian shores on the 20th of June, the Explorer arrived at the wreck site on the rather auspicious date of the 4th of July. The voyage had been uneventful, with last-minute fine-tuning and repair of the ship's systems en route. The crew had been busy, but they were in good spirits and looking forward to the mammoth task ahead of them. Upon arrival, preparations began for the recovery effort. They dropped transponders and buoys that would feed location data into the ship's automatic station-keeping system, and began the process of readying the capture vehicle and the heavy lift systems. However, the weather was against them. Tropical Storm Gilda was causing rougher than ideal seas, with vertical surges in the moon pool topping 8 foot. They would not be lifting anything in this weather. The storm eventually moved on, leaving calmer waters in its wake, but precious time had been lost. On the 13th of July, the Explorer had some unexpected visitors. Maritime law requires vessels to assist others in times of emergency, so when the British merchant ship, the Belle Hudson, radioed the Explorer to request medical attention for a crew member suffering from a suspected heart attack, the Explorer was legally bound to help. The last thing the CIA wanted was a raft of unknown people coming aboard the Explorer, but if they refused assistance, it would be highly irregular and would draw unwanted attention to the operation. The Explorer agreed to take the critically ill sailor on board, lifting him from a raft with a crane and rushing him to the onboard medical centre. After several tests, it was determined that this sailor was not suffering from a heart attack, but had, instead, multiple broken ribs. He could not account for these broken ribs. One assumes alcohol was involved. After being given some rather strong painkillers, he was sent back to his ship, and the merchant vessel headed on its way, after leaving the Explorer with a case of scotch for their trouble. In the end, the unexpected visit probably aided in the Explorer's cover. By responding as a normal mining ship would and arranging the transfer over open commercial radio channels, its legitimacy was bolstered. The British merchant ship was an unexpected, yet not wholly unwelcome visitor. When a Soviet naval ship arrived on the 17th of July, they were expected, but a lot less welcome. The Soviet naval vessel Chazma was a missile-range instrumentation ship, and its purpose was to aid in the tracking of Soviet missile tests and space launch recovery events. It was on its way back from a Soyuz launch and recovery, and was diverted to pay a visit to the new American mining ship. As the Explorer's crew detected the vessel's approach, they were understandably concerned. They knew that the Chazma carried with it a helicopter, so to prevent them landing it on the Explorer, they covered the helipad with a number of crates. The arrival of the Russians did not mean that the gig was up. The Soviets weren't only on the lookout for military activity, they would be just as satisfied with conducting a little corporate espionage. That being said, the Explorer was in a difficult position. The nearest warship was over 400 miles away, so the crew were absolutely on their own. In the planning stages, there were many who felt that a contingent of Marines should be stationed on board, in case the Soviets tried to board the ship. But calmer heads prevailed, realising that the cover story would be wholly undermined if the ship was armed to the teeth. Unbeknownst to all but a handful of crew, there were a number of firearms on board, purchased directly by the security officer from run-of-the-mill Californian gun shops. There are a total of 8 guns on board, a mix of civilian pattern rifles and shotguns, with the rifles purported to be for shooting seabirds from the deck of the ship, and the shotguns for clay pigeon shooting. They even brought along a clay pigeon launcher to boost the story's credibility. Upon arrival, the Soviet vessel launched its helicopter, which circled the Explorer for about an hour, taking photographs from every angle, whilst crew on the Chazma also took photos and surveyed the ship with binoculars. It was a tense time for the crew, as the helicopter was sent up again to circle the Explorer, and the Chazma drew ever closer. Eventually the Chazma attempted to make contact, initially via a blinking light system, but this proved impractical because of the worsening fog. After switching to a flag-based system, the conversation proved to be a little odd. The Soviet vessel sent a message indicating they were ready to receive a message. The Explorer replied stating that they had no message, and that they understood that the Chazma had a message for them. The Chasma then transmitted, "We are on our way home and heard your foghorn. What are you doing here?" That was highly unlikely, as when the Explorer's foghorn was active, the Chasma was far outside of its range. The Explorer replied, "We are conducting ocean mining tests, deep ocean mining tests." And after being asked what kind of vessel they were, the Explorer said that they were a deep ocean mining vessel. The Chasma asked what kind of equipment they had on board and how long they would be there. The Explorer replied that they had experimental deep ocean mining equipment on board and expected to finish testing in 2 to 3 weeks. The Chasma then wished them the best and departed on the 18th of July, the day after they arrived. The initial plan allowed for 2 to 3 weeks for recovery, but as of the 21st of July, 17 days after arrival on site, the capture vehicle, Clementine, wasn't even in the water. Weather conditions and technical hurdles had kept the plan progressing at a snail's pace, but the weather was clearing and the immediate technical problems had been overcome. A little after midnight on the 21st, Clementine was in the water, and they began the long and laborious task of lowering her into the depths, 30 foot at a time. The crew of the Explorer were glad to see the Soviet naval ship depart, but were significantly less pleased to see the arrival of another Soviet ship on the morning of the 22nd, the SB-10, a sea-going salvage tug. Initially it sat 3 to 4 miles away from the Explorer, but in short order it had approached and began to circle the Explorer, taking photos and watching through binoculars, passing within 200 feet of the vessel. The approaches would continue during the day and then back off at night, only to resume again in the following morning. As this cycle continued day by day, Clementine was quietly descending into the depths below them in search of her prize. On the 26th of July, the sonar systems mounted to Clementine detected the ocean floor. At this point, 230 double sections of pipe had been deployed, with a total length of 13,800 feet. The high-resolution sonar systems were activated to home in on the submerged sub. The mood on board the ship was electric. One of the officers detailed the events as follows. Everyone on board was caught up in the anticipation of seeing the target object for the first time. The main source of action was the control center. All eyes were watching the display from the scanning sonars, our long-range detectors, for any sign of a return. The yellow dots marched across the cathode ray tube in unending regularity. Then on one pass, an irregular hemispherical hump displaced the flat line on the screen. 1, 2, 3, and more times it was the same. It was the submarine hulk for sure. Word spread rapidly throughout the ship. We were on target. After performing a number of passes over the wreck, examining it with a fine tooth comb, looking for unseen ocean floor features or damage to the hull that would interfere with the lift, they spotted something unexpected. There was a single, ball-peen hammer lying on the surface of the sub's hull. They compared the images they were seeing with images taken by their previous visits to the wreck and could not see the hammer in any of them. A diver had to have dropped it whilst working in the moon pool, where it sank 16,500 feet to the ocean floor below, coming to rest directly on top of the K129's battered hull. With Clementine attached to 16,500 feet of pipe string, the heavy lift system was supporting 12 million pounds of weight, almost double any of the previous tests. The ship creaked and groaned, and if you stood in the central bay of the ship, you could watch the walls of the moon pool flex. This was to be expected, but it was rather disconcerting for the crew. As they began positioning Clementine above the wreck, they were surprised to find that the ocean floor was much harder than expected. The capture vehicle had been fitted with profiling sonar, to be used instead of the television cameras that they had assumed would be useless due to the amount of silt that would be kicked up by Clementine's hydraulic thrusters. The ocean floor proved to be much more rock-like, and the thrusters kicked up no silt, just a stream of bubbles. With that potential issue avoided, they lowered the rear breakaway legs of the capture vehicle onto the ocean floor, either side of the sub, followed by the front legs, so that it straddled the Soviet wreck. Now that the capture vehicle was resting on the ocean floor, they could unload some of its weight from the heavy lift system of the ship, easing a full 1 million pounds of weight off of the system into the ocean bottom. They extended the claw arms of Clementine wide around the sub and carefully enshrouded the sub's hull. Whilst the lack of silt on the ocean floor had been a boon for the continued use of the television cameras, it proved troublesome for the grabbing action of the capture vehicle. The designers had hoped to be able to push the arms of the claw into the ocean floor below the submarine's hull to get a better grip, But even after unloading another 2 million pounds of weight into the ocean floor, the claw arms refused to sink in, which left them hoping that the arms would close in further after they had lifted the sub. There was some disagreement between the technicians operating Clementine. Some favoured a tight grip around the hull to prevent any movement as they raised the sub. Others recommended a looser grip, hoping to limit any further damage to its hull. They settled on a looser grip, but as they closed the claw to secure the sub, it shifted a little, rolling further onto its side. It still appeared that it would fit through the opening in the bottom of the ship, but it was yet another unknown that might cause problems later. Now that they had the submarine in their grasp, they were ready to begin the breakout procedure, the first section of the lift, whereby they pull the submarine wreck out of the ocean floor, where it had lain for the last 6 years. They initiated the pressurizing of the breakout legs, sending seawater down the pipe string umbilical to begin extending the legs, so that they pushed against the ocean floor. At the same time, the heavy lift system began pulling up on the pipe string, with the submarine now firmly in the grasp of the capture vehicle. As the pistons slowly extended, pushing into the ocean floor with over 5 million pounds of force, the submarine's hull pulled free, cleanly. It was now fully supported by Clementine. They had managed to capture the sub. Cheers rang out from the control centre, with word of the successful breakout spreading like wildfire around the ship. This was arguably the stage of the plan with the greatest potential for failure, and they had just accomplished it. But the cheers soon subsided. The heave compensator suffered a mechanical breakdown and would take a few hours to fix. This left the ship with the full 3 miles of pipe string, the capture vehicle and the submarine wreck, all hanging from its now broken heavy lift system. 14 million pounds of weight, dangling 3 miles below the Explorer. To relieve some of the pressure on the system, they further extended the breakout legs into the ocean floor whilst the repairs were made. This caused the submarine to shift slightly in the grasp of the capture vehicle, sending a violent wave of energy up the pipe string, where the ensuing vibrations were felt by many on board. And that was just a slight shifting of the sub. Nobody wanted to think about what would happen if there was a more dramatic change in the load. After a nerve-wracking few hours, the repairs were complete. The heave system was now in working order, once again isolating the heavy lift system from the up and down motion of the vessel. During all of this, the Soviet tug was continuing its routine of close passes to the Explorer, taking photos as they went. The Explorer crew could only hope that their observers were unaware of what was going on below the surface. 24 hours later, they performed the breakout procedure again, pushing downwards with the breakout legs whilst pulling up on the pipe string. This time it went without a hitch. Now all they had to do was haul up 16,500 feet of pipe string, a Soviet submarine, and Clementine. On the first day of the lift, they reeled in 3,000 feet of pipe string, and every pipe double that was removed was 15 tons less weight for the heavy lift system to strain against. Even so, the stresses on the system were unimaginable. Because of the incredible forces at play within the lift system, only the controllers were allowed anywhere near it. As the strain continued and settled, these forces found the weakest points of the ship, where it would fire the inch-wide bolts out of the walls. This sort of thing was expected, but they fired off like bullets and could easily kill a person, hence the need to restrict access to that section of the ship. The second lift began on the 1st of April, and on the 3rd, with good progress being made, the Explorer radioed through to Midway, the US naval base at Hawaii. They claimed that their mining vessel had hit a rocky outcrop on the ocean floor, and it required immediate repairs. It was actually an excuse to dock at the naval base, to unload some of the more important finds of whatever intelligence they would glean from the ever-rising submarine wreckage. These finds would be transferred to an aircraft and flown to an unknown research facility, to be examined in detail. This was speculated to be Area 51, given Lockheed's history with the site, and the dry Nevada desert air would be greatly beneficial for the preservation of the recovered items. They were advised that the purported damage to the mining vessel would require parts from the mainland, so the vessel would depart from Midway to head back to the mainland for further offloading of recovered intelligence. Shortly after 9 AM on the 4th of August, exactly a month after arriving on site, a shudder ran through the ship. Something had gone wrong. As the command crew raced to the control centre, they knew that something wasn't right. Unless the Soviet tug had run into the Explorer, something had to have happened to the sub. So, when the views from the television cameras on the capture vehicle showed the intact sub in the grasp of its claws, slowly rising from the depths, they were utterly confused. The Soviet tug had not hit them, so whatever had sent a shockwave through the ship had to have travelled through the pipe string. The control centre called to the heavy lift operators as they scrambled to release pressure from the system, and they confirmed the worst. There had been a sudden and dramatic loss of weight from the pipe string. Yet, the video feed clearly showed nothing wrong. So what on earth was going on? The technical staff held an emergency meeting to determine what had happened. It didn't take them long to work out the mystery. To save bandwidth, the camera feed would only refresh when it detected a change in the image it was capturing. The camera hadn't detected a change, so it hadn't refreshed their view. They reset the system and got a live view from Clementine, clutching the sub in its claws. Or rather, what was left of it. Several of the arms of the capture vehicle had failed, and at least half of the wreck of K129 had fallen back into the depths. The men around the screen sank into their chairs, crestfallen. The hard part was over. They'd pulled it out of the seabed and hauled it more than a mile up from the ocean floor. No one had expected a failure at this point. If something catastrophic was going to go wrong, they expected it when they were first lifting the sub, not now. Not when a third of the pipe string had been hauled back on board. But they still had something. They still had a chunk of the submarine in the grasp of the capture vehicle, and who knows what it might contain, so all was not lost. They halted the lift while deciding how to proceed and sent an encrypted message to the CIA headquarters in Langley to inform them of the situation. The response that they got back was a little unexpected. They were ordered to send Clementine back down to retrieve the rest of the sub. This was clearly impossible. The capture vehicle was damaged, the breakout legs detached, and they had no way of knowing where the other part of the sub had fallen. As the wreck fell back into the depths, it was highly likely to have fractured into smaller pieces, and these would inevitably drift, not fall straight down. A response was sent explaining these issues, but the deputy director of the CIA refused to back down, replying, "Return to ocean bottom and recover remainder of target. This is not a request, this is an order." The command crew of the Explorer was stunned. The deputy director was known to be a strong-willed man, but one who would always see reason when presented with evidence. The crew began preparing a carefully worded response explaining that it simply wasn't possible, when another message came in, signed by the deputy director himself. "Proceed with plan to continue ascent. Disregard previous order." They breathed a collective sigh of relief and began the process of raising the remainder of the submarine wreck from the depths. We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors. The incredible story of the K129 and its recovery has been detailed in Joss Dean's book, The Taking of K129. If you're enjoying this episode, you will undoubtedly enjoy the book. It's expertly researched and written and goes into vastly more detail than is possible in this episode, so it's well worth the read. If you want to purchase a copy, might I suggest buying it from bookshop.org. Bookshop.org is an online bookstore that helps to support your local bookshops. They give away 75% of their profits to publishers, authors, and your corner bookstore. So if you're living in the United States or the United Kingdom, you can enjoy the convenience of ordering a book online while still supporting your all-important local booksellers. If you want to help out the podcast, you can purchase a copy of the K129 via my referral link, which you can find in the show notes, or go to bookshop.org/shop/TheMediaWard. Right, back to the show. Over the next 2 days, they continued pulling submarine upwards, pipe string section after pipe string section. All the while, the Soviet tugboat continued its routine of passing close and then backing off. As Clementine rose from the depths, people began to congregate near the moon pool. As one officer later recalled, everyone wanted to get the first glimpse of the target. Those of us waiting anxiously on deck received a reward of a different type. Bobbing up to the surface, luckily in the well, was a brimming full jerry can full of torpedo juice. It had travelled over 3 miles to the bottom and back, and been subjected to pressures of over 7,000 pounds per square inch, without spilling a drop. This rising detritus was a cause for concern. If the crew of the SB-10 discovered an old naval uniform or can of torpedo fuel floating around, they would realise something was up, and the situation could escalate fast. The Soviet tug was still harassing the Explorer even with the heavy fog that enveloped them both. It would move in as close to 75 yards, the Explorer would train a spotlight on the tug, and then they would slowly drift away. As the sub ascended nearer the surface, the risk of being noticed by the Soviet tug grew ever more threatening. The SB-10 was deemed to have limited shallow water dive capability for assistance during salvage operations, but they were unlikely to have divers on board capable of the underwater reconnaissance required to catch a glimpse of the sub rising from the depths. On the 6th of August, the SB-10 approached to within 75 yards. The Explorer warned them to stay clear, and with that, they blasted their horn 3 times, waved goodbye, and sailed off, homeward bound. The surveillance lasted 13 days and 16 hours, and the submarine wreck was about an hour or 2 from reaching the surface. At 9:20 p.m. on August the 6th, the Explorer's docking legs latched onto Clementine, releasing the last of the strain on the heavy lift system. They hoisted the submarine wreck in through the moon pool, closing the gates behind it. Once on board, the scale of what had been lost was clear. Everything from the conning tower and back had fallen away, 2/3 of the sub, including the missile launch system and code rooms. On top of that devastating loss, the radiation monitors reported 5 times that of standard background radiation. The salvage crew were in for a difficult time. When the sub was hoisted into the bay, it began to drip sand, mud, and all other kinds of unidentified muck into the now drained moon pool. All of it was collected and processed, while fragments of the sub were pulled out for further investigation and fragments of bone were sent to the morgue for storage. As the sub had imploded as it sank into the depth 6 years prior, any internal space that wasn't filled with water had compacted, so open spaces shrank and their walls were left jagged and torn. The submarine wreckage had sat undisturbed on the ocean floor at freezing temperatures, but now that it was in the relatively warm belly of the Explorer, the hull began to rapidly oxidize, and the stench of rotting human flesh started filling the air. To keep the bay cold and attempt to keep the odours at bay, the Explorer had on board more than 100 industrial air conditioning units, which were running around the clock. The radioactive contamination was a concern, but not wholly unexpected. The contamination was plutonium. It didn't float in the air, and even if you were to get it onto your skin, you could wash it off with water with no real issues. The danger was that if you happened to scratch yourself on any of the sharp edges inside the sub's crushed form, and whatever had pierced your skin was tainted with plutonium, that was likely to be fatal. Progress was slow going, with the crews that tore the sub apart working slowly and carefully in multiple layers of protective gear, wearing breathing apparatus when they were required to cut away sections of the sub, as this would vaporize the plutonium. Little by little, they worked their way through the submarine, carefully removing components, cleaning them, examining them, packaging up the interesting bits for further study. So, what did they get? The CIA has never released a full inventory of what they managed to recover from the submarine's wreckage, and it doesn't seem likely that they ever will, but there is still a fair amount of information available from various sources. At the time, it was thought that the Soviet submarine program was ahead of the American program. However, what they found in the wreckage entirely disproved that. The steel hull plates were inconsistent, with varying thicknesses and irregular welds. They found timber supporting certain sections, and hundreds of lead weights for manually adjusting the centre of gravity of the vessel. The Soviets were not ahead of the Americans, they were behind them. Whilst they had lost the section of the submarine that contained the ballistic missiles, the distribution of nuclear material throughout the wreckage provided valuable information as to the specifics of the warhead design. A large number of documents were retrieved, the most important being a 2-inch thick journal detailing the capabilities of the newly refitted Gulf-class submarine and its onboard nuclear missiles. Even some of the less interesting items proved to be of value. By examining items such as valves and plating, it was possible to establish where they had been made, giving an insight into the manufacturing and logistic capabilities of the Soviet Union. The recovered section may not have had any nuclear missiles, but it did contain the 2 nuclear-tipped torpedoes that the K129 was carrying. The disassembly of these must have provided a great deal of valuable intelligence, but they also revealed a possible explanation for the sinking of the vessel. According to a declassified CIA document, one of the torpedoes had suffered a partial detonation, whereby the high explosive portion of the warhead detonated, without the nuclear component detonating. This detonation may have been triggered by whatever calamity caused the vessel to sink, or there's a chance it was the root cause. There are many theories as to what happened to the sub, from accidentally taking on water during running of the diesel motors, a collision with an American submarine, or the partial detonation of one of the ballistic missiles. There have been consistent rumours, bolstered by off-the-record comments from intelligence officers, that the recovered intelligence from Project Azorian was far more significant than has ever been publicly acknowledged. There's no real way to verify or disprove those claims, so I'll leave you to form your own opinions on that matter. Within the shattered submarine were the bodies of 6 Soviet submariners, who were shrouded in a Soviet naval insignia and given a formal burial at sea. They flew in an ex-Soviet captain who had defected to oversee and guide the ceremony to ensure its compliance with Soviet tradition. 75 of the ship's crew gathered on deck, whilst members of the mission spoke.
The fact that our nations have had disagreements does not lessen in any way our respect for them and the service they have rendered. Today we honor these 6 men, their shipmates, and all men who give their lives in patriotic service.
The entire ceremony was filmed and in the early 90s presented to President of the Russian Federation, Boris Yeltsin, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The mission had been a partial success, but the failure of the capture vehicle had robbed the project of a large portion of the potential intelligence it set out to recover. A number of the tines, the claw-like arms of the capture vehicle, had broken off, allowing the bulk of the submarine to fall from its grasp. This failure can be traced all the way back to a failure during the early reconnaissance missions. There had been an attempt to collect a sample of the ocean floor at the wreck site, but the collection device had snapped off when its arm hit a rocky outcrop. Because the designers had no idea what the ocean floor around the wreck consisted of, they chose a hard variety of steel that would have the greatest chance of piercing the surface. It turned out the ocean floor was incredibly hard, so hard that even after unloading several million pounds of force, they couldn't push the arms of the capture vehicle into it. Choosing a type of steel is always a trade-off. Softer steels are more likely to deform under pressure but are unlikely to snap and are better able to deal with flexing. Harder steels are less likely to deform but are less able to deal with flexing, and when overstressed they are more likely to shatter. This is what happened to the arms of the capture vehicle. Several of them were overstressed and shattered, allowing the bulk of the wreck to slip back down into the abyss. From the off, plans were set in motion to recover the remaining section of the submarine. The capture vehicle would be repaired, and the tines would be replaced with a softer but more resilient steel, as well as a host of other small improvements. There was of course pushback against such a plan, as Project Azorian had already cost at least $250 million, but after a 40-1 vote, the plan to recover the rest of the sub was put into effect. With that, Project Matador was born. The latest American special project submarine, the USS Seawolf, was launched towards the wreck site to attempt to locate the lost section of K129 and photograph it. If they were going back, they had to know where it was and what state it was now in. Just before the Glomar Explorer had set sail in June 1974, thieves had broken into the offices of the Summer Corporation, the corporation owned by Howard Hughes. During the robbery, a number of documents were stolen, amongst which was thought to be a single memo that tied Howard Hughes to the CIA and the CIA to the Glomar Explorer. Desperate to recover this document, the CIA called in the FBI, who in turn enlisted detectives of the LAPD. They were given basic briefings as to the nature of this document and told to keep any investigation under wraps, but word somehow made its way to the LA Times. In the autumn of 1974, a Soviet embassy received a note stating, "Certain authorities of the United States are taking measures to raise a Soviet submarine sunk in the Pacific Ocean," signed by someone that referred to themselves as a well-wisher. Such rumours and tip-offs were nothing new, but the majority of them were unsubstantiated. Although there was no public reaction from the Soviet Union, in private things were a little different. In December of 1974, at a party for foreign naval attachés, a Soviet officer approached a US naval officer and said that they were aware of the CIA's initial attempts to recover the K129, and that if they went back again, it would mean war. In February of 1975, the LA Times published an article claiming that the CIA were attempting to raise a Soviet submarine with the help of the Hughes Tool Company. The story was riddled with errors, claiming for example that the submarine was in the Atlantic Ocean, whereas it was actually the Pacific. The mission title was given as Operation Jennifer, which was incorrect, but was derived instead from the name for the security procedures adopted during Project Azorian. Such factual errors made the story easy to discredit, but in the end the CIA went a different route. After giving basic briefings to a host of newspaper editors detailing the true nature of the recovery, the CIA instructed the media to refrain from covering the story any further, in the interests of national security. It worked. It came down to the wire, with stories being pulled hours before being put into print, but the newspaper editors agreed to keep silent. Project Matador was progressing, with the repairs of the capture vehicle in progress and reconnaissance of the wreck site ongoing, and now that they had the media on side, confidence was growing within the CIA. But it was not to last. Jack Anderson was one of the journalists who the CIA appealed to, but unlike the others, he decided to spill the beans. After his story was released on the 18th of March 1975, the other news sources followed suit. It was part of the deal that they had made with the CIA. They would be allowed to publish in the event that the story was leaked. With news choppers circling the docked Glomar Explorer, it was clear that Matador was scrubbed. It was now time to await the Soviets' reaction. Initially, the Soviet Union accused the United States of breaking international law, but this was quickly withdrawn. They kept a rotating cast of warships stationed over the wreck, but that was about as overt as the response got. It was embarrassing for the Soviets. They had lost one of their subs, failed to track it down, and for the Americans to then snatch it from under their noses was truly rubbing salt into the wound. The story didn't make its way into any of the Russian domestic news sources, and it wasn't publicly addressed until decades later. Project Matador officially continued for a few months, but the writing was on the wall. Eventually, Clementine, the capture vehicle, was cut up and sold for scrap. HMB-1, the submersible barge, was towed to San Francisco and mothballed until 1982, when Lockheed, the people who had designed it, ended up buying it. It was put to work to facilitate the secretive construction of the IX-529 Sea Shadow, an experimental stealth ship built in conjunction with DARPA, a research and development wing of the Department of Defense. Whilst the project never made it past this prototype stage, a clone of the ship featured heavily in the James Bond film Tomorrow Never Dies. The barge is still in active use as a dry dock in Alameda, although after a refit, it is no longer able to fully submerge. Rather, it partially submerges, allows a vessel to enter it, where it then rises again, draining the water, leaving the contained vessel more easily worked upon. The Hughes Glomar Explorer also outlived Project Azorian, although not without a few hurdles. The government invited companies to submit proposals for leasing the ship, as although various governmental departments expressed interest in using the ship, none of them came to fruition. Lockheed submitted a $3 million proposal to retrieve inert Soviet warheads from the Pacific Ocean, but no bank would lend them the money, so that plan was also scrapped. Global Marine wanted to buy the ship outright, but due to the hydraulic system on board having contaminated the vessel, the US government were legally unable to sell it to them, so instead it was mothballed for a short time. Then, in a satisfying twist of fate, Lockheed leased the ship to conduct underwater mining operations, harvesting manganese nodules, the very thing that the Explorer was claimed to be doing from the start. However, the commercial version of the mining apparatus would have set Lockheed's investors back around $1 billion, so the project was abandoned. Subsequently, it was leased back to Global Marine, by then rebranded as Global Santa Fe, on a 30-year contract. It was converted into a deep-sea ocean exploration vehicle. During the conversion process, the engineers were flabbergasted by the level of technological advancement, describing it as decades ahead of its time. In 1998, it drilled its first ocean-based oil well on contract for Chevron, which was a record-breaking 7,800 feet underwater. In 2010, Global Marine, then Global Santa Fe, and finally Transocean ended up buying the vessel from the US government for $15 million, turning it into the world's largest offshore drilling vessel. The Explorer's voyage came to an end in 2015, when falling oil prices caused the vessel to be sold for scrap, finally terminating its long and illustrious career. Project Azorian was neither a complete success nor a failure, and it's up for debate whether it had any measurable effect on the Cold War. The political ramifications of the mission are unclear, but the technological feat achieved was astounding. It was a 6-year culmination of a vast array of technologies, many of which had to be invented for the mission. Couple that with the fact that it stayed under wraps until completion, and you really can't help but marvel at the whole affair. I will leave you with the words of Admiral de Gela, the Soviet commander in charge of the submarine fleet that the K129 belonged to, speaking on a Russian TV network. The fact that the US managed to build a ship of 60,000 tons displacement, to install equipment to sustain such a load, to make provisions of how to accommodate the submarine under the ship and finally lift it up, it seemed to us something unreal, fantastic. I can compare it with a mission to the moon in regard to technology and invested money. And another point. The ship was built in 2 years, and the disinformation was organised outstandingly. That brings this 2-part episode to a close. If you like the podcast, you might like my YouTube channel. Find it at youtube.com/TheMediaWard. If you want to support the podcast, please rate it, subscribe, or share it with a friend. It all helps more than you might imagine. If you want to be even more amazing, perhaps you might consider supporting me on Patreon. There you'll find ad-free episodes, get access to episodes 2 weeks early, and on top of that, 1 extra episode every season. You'll also get access to behind-the-scenes content for the YouTube channel, such as extended cuts and bloopers. You can find me at patreon.com/TheMediaWard. I'd like to thank St. Valentine Music for providing all of the music you've heard in today's episode. The primary source for these episodes is The Taking of K129, the most daring covert operation in history, written by John Dean. It is a superb book, and if you enjoyed these episodes, I'd wager you'd love the book. For a full list of my sources, please visit the website at TheMediaWard.co.uk. And one last thing. We can neither confirm nor deny the existence of such a document. This phrase exemplifies the mystery and evasiveness of the intelligence services, and it can trace its roots all the way back to Project Azorian. The Freedom of Information Act means that a federal agency must release documents when requested, unless there is a good reason not to, such as national security. After a Rolling Stone reporter made such a request, the CIA was faced with a conundrum. They couldn't release the information, but to deny the request on the grounds of national security would confirm that such documents existed. The CIA's in-house legal team had a way around this, however, by responding that they could neither confirm nor deny the existence of such documents. They were able to fulfill their legal obligations without giving anything away.